Sophie adjusted her apron as she wiped down the counter at Maple Diner, a small but cozy restaurant on the outskirts of town. The place was almost empty, just a few regulars sipping coffee. The evening shift was usually slow, and she welcomed the quiet after a long day. The doorbell jingled, and Sophie turned to see a tall, well-dressed man enter. His expensive suit and polished shoes made him stand out from the usual crowd. He looked out of place, yet something about him seemed strangely familiar. As the man settled into a booth, Sophie approached him with a warm smile. "Good evening, sir. What can I get for you?" He looked up, his piercing blue eyes studying her for a moment. "Just a coffee," he said in a deep, controlled voice. Sophie nodded and quickly poured him a cup. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had seen him somewhere before. Maybe on TV? A magazine. When she returned with his coffee, he was pulling out his wallet, searching for something. That's when her breath caught in her throat. A small, old photograph peeked out from the wallet. Her mother's face was staring back at her. Sophie's heart pounded. Her hands trembled as she stared at the photo in shock. She looked up at the man, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, why is my mother's picture in your wallet?" The man froze, his fingers tightening around the leather wallet. A flicker of recognition flashed across his face, but he said nothing. Sophie's mind raced with a million questions. Who was this man? And what connection did he have to her mother? The air between them grew thick with tension. The billionaire's grip on his wallet tightened as his jaw clenched. Sophie's heart pounded as she waited for an answer. Finally, the man sighed, closing his eyes for a moment before looking up at her. "What's your mother's name?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Sophie hesitated. Why did he need to ask? Did he not already know? Her name was Eleanor Parker. The man's face paled instantly. His fingers slightly trembled as he gently placed the wallet on the table. He stared at the coffee in front of him, as if lost in a memory. Sophie's stomach twisted. Who was this man? Why did her mother's name affect him so deeply? "I knew Eleanor," he finally said, his voice filled with something between sadness and disbelief. "A long time ago." Sophie's breath hitched. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table. "How? How did you know her?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath, then met Sophie's gaze with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine, because she saved my life. Sophie's eyes widened. What? He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. I wouldn't be here today if it weren't for Eleanor Parker. The weight of his words sank into Sophie's chest like a stone. Her mother had never spoken about anything like this before. She had passed away years ago, leaving behind so many unanswered doubts, and now, a billionaire CEO was sitting in front of her, claiming her mother had saved his life. Sophie swallowed hard. She needed to know the truth. Sophie's hands trembled as she clutched her notepad, her mind racing with questions. My mother saved your life? How? When? The billionaire, still gripping his wallet, took a deep breath. His eyes darkened as he was pulled into the past. It was nearly 30 years ago, he began, his voice softer now. I was just a broke kid, trying to survive in the city. No family. No direction. One night, I made a mistake. I got mixed up with the wrong people. Sophie leaned in, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. I was caught up in a street deal gone bad. Some guys thought I owed them money. I didn't, but that didn't matter to them. I was cornered in a back alley, alone and terrified. And then, he paused, shaking his head as if he could still see it happening. Your mother appeared out of nowhere. Sophie's eyes widened. Her mother? In an alley? What was she doing there? She worked at a small diner nearby, the man continued. She always closed up late, and that night, she must have heard the shouting. Before I knew it, she stepped between me and them. Sophie swallowed hard. What did she do? She convinced them to let me go. She talked to them like she knew them. Told them I wasn't worth their trouble. And somehow, they listened. Sophie felt her throat tighten. Her mother had risked her life for this man. I never forgot her, the billionaire admitted. She saved me when no one else would. Sophie's mind was spinning. What else had her mother never told her? She took a deep breath. So why do you still carry her picture after all these years? The man looked down at the photo. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, because I owe her everything. Sophie's fingers curled around the edge of the table, her pulse quickening. You owe her everything, she echoed, barely able to process the weight of his words. The billionaire nodded, his expression distant, lost in memories. That night, your mother didn't just save me from those men, she changed the course of my life. Sophie's brows furrowed. How? He exhaled, a ghost of a smile forming on his lips. After that night, I was shaken. I realized I was on a path to destruction, and if I didn't change, I wouldn't live to see another year. But I had no idea where to start. Sophie remained silent, listening intently. Your mother, she wasn't just kind that night. She saw something in me. She told me to come by the diner the next day. Said if I wanted to turn my life around, I needed structure, discipline, and a hot meal. Sophie's lips parted. She helped you? She gave me my first job. The man chuckled, shaking his head. I started washing dishes in that tiny diner, working long shifts, earning just enough to keep myself afloat. But she gave me more than just work. She gave me guidance. Sophie's heart clenched. That was exactly the kind of thing her mother would do. She made me read books when I wasn't working. She forced me to dream beyond my circumstances. She believed I could do something great, even when I didn't believe it myself. Tears stung Sophie's eyes. That sounds like her, she whispered. The billionaire's gaze softened. I worked at that diner for 2 years before I got my first big break. Your mother saw me off the day I left, and she told me one thing: never forget where you came from. And never stop helping others. Sophie swallowed hard. And you never forgot her? He shook his head. Not for a second. He lifted the wallet again. This picture reminds me of the woman who saved my life. The woman who made me the man I am today. A lump formed in Sophie's throat. She never told me about you. The billionaire's eyes darkened. There's more, Sophie. Something your mother never told you. Something that might change everything. Sophie's breath hitched. What do you mean? What didn't she tell me? The billionaire hesitated, his fingers brushing over the worn photograph in his wallet. His expression was unreadable, somewhere between pain and resolve. She never told you about me, because she didn't want you to know what I owe her. Sophie's heart pounded. What do you mean? He sighed, leaning forward. Your mother, she didn't just give me a job. She saved my life twice. Sophie's stomach twisted. Twice? He nodded. After working at the diner for 2 years, I got my first opportunity in business. A small investment deal. I thought it would be my big break. But I was still reckless, still learning. I made a bad decision and ended up in serious debt to the wrong people. Sophie could barely breathe. Debt? A group of dangerous men, loan sharks. They wanted their money back, with interest. And when I couldn't pay, they came after me. His jaw tightened. They gave me 24 hours to come up with the money, or they'd make sure I never did business again. Sophie's hands trembled. What happened? I was out of options. I had no one to turn to. But your mother, she found out. I don't know how, but she did. And instead of letting me run, she did the unthinkable. Sophie's voice was barely a whisper. What did she do? He swallowed hard. She took every penny she had, her entire life savings, and paid them off. Just to save me. Sophie gasped, her eyes stinging with fresh tears. No, she wouldn't. She did. His voice was thick with emotion. Not just from students, but from Dr. Hamilton himself. Professor Whitaker's face burned with humiliation. His challenge had backfired spectacularly. Amira placed the chalk down and faced him. Still a lucky guess, Professor? He had no answer. Professor Whitaker's face remained frozen in disbelief as the students erupted into whispers. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances, others scribbled down notes, trying to understand how Amira had solved the problem so effortlessly. Dr. Hamilton leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Well," he said, breaking the silence, "that was quite the display. Brilliant work, Amira." A few students clapped hesitantly, but Whitaker slammed his hand on the desk, silencing the room. "This doesn't prove anything," he sneered. "One problem doesn't make you a genius." Amira raised an eyebrow, unbothered. "Then perhaps you'd like to give me another?" A challenging silence stretched between them. Whitaker's pride was too wounded to back down. "Fine," he snapped, turning to the board. This time, he wouldn't hold back. He picked up the chalk and began scrawling an exceptionally advanced calculus problem, one so intricate that even the graduate students in the room shifted uncomfortably. When he stepped back, he smirked. "Let's see how you handle this." Amira didn't even blink. She studied the problem, her mind working faster than anyone could follow. Then, she started writing. The confidence in her strokes was undeniable. Line by line, she deconstructed the problem, weaving through complex concepts effortlessly. Halfway through, Dr. Hamilton let out a soft chuckle. He saw it already. She was right again. Whitaker's smirk faded as realization dawned. He had given her a problem so difficult that even he struggled with it in his early years. Yet here she was, solving it like it was a simple exercise. When Amira finally placed the chalk down, the answer stared him in the face, flawless. A hush fell over the classroom. Whitaker clenched his jaw. He had lost, and everyone knew it. The tension in the room was so thick it could be cut with a knife. Professor Whitaker's face twisted in disbelief as he stared at the perfectly solved equation. His hands clenched into fists, his pride burning under the weight of his own challenge. The students were silent at first, stunned. Then, a ripple of odd murmurs filled the lecture hall. Did she just? No way. That was impossible. I can't believe this. Dr. Hamilton, watching the scene unfold, couldn't help but smile. He had known Amira's brilliance, but seeing it in action was something else. Professor Whitaker wasn't ready to accept defeat. He turned back to the board, scanning for a flaw, any mistake, anything he could use to discredit her. But the more he examined it, the more his own humiliation settled in. Amira crossed her arms, her voice cool but unwavering. "Is there a mistake, Professor?"